Hello and welcome back to Crime on the Clarkfork, the true crime podcast where I tell you about big crimes that happened in small places, with each case having occurred in areas with populations of 15,000 or less. My name is Mackenzie Spence, for those of you who are tuning in for the first time, and I'm really excited you're here for this episode. And for this episode, we're heading up north to Canada. I was so excited to see that I have a Canadian listener, and I thought it was a good time to jump up there to cover a case. So, hello to my Canadian listener. I'm glad you're here. I'm also very excited you're here. So, the sources for this week's episode are Province of Manitoba, Wikipedia, NBC News, allthat'sinteresting.com, Google Maps, Medium.com, CBS News, CBC Canada, Statesboro Herald, BBC News, The Globe and Mail, Vice.com, Winnipeg Free Press, timslaw.ca, and the Brandon Sun. I also just want to give a few trigger warnings here because this case is pretty grisly. So this episode talks about mental health, suicide, cannibalism, and decapitation. So please listen with care. If that's not your vibe, skip this week and I will see you in my next episode. So this week, the Greyhound bus horror. Let's get right into it. Portage-la Prairie, Manitoba, Canada, 2008. Population 14,469. And I do want to say the crime occurred about 40 kilometers from Portage-la Prairie, but it was the nearest town, so that's just the one that I pulled from. And I was a little worried because it was almost 15,000, but we're okay. 14,469, that is well within our numbers here. So, it was July 30th, 2008. And Tim McLean, a 22-year-old Canadian man, was on a Greyhound bus heading from Edmonton to his home in Winnipeg. He had been in Edmonton working a fair as a carnival barker, which is someone who tries to attract passersby to events, such as fairs or maybe a circus. So he was working a fair in Edmonton and was on his way home. Bus 1170 took the Yellowhead Highway from Edmonton through Saskatchewan toward Winnipeg and was a 24-hour trip for McLean. Many of his friends offered to purchase him a plane ticket for the trip so he wouldn't have to take the long trip by bus, but McLean refused the offers and insisted on riding the bus. When McLean got on the bus, he went and sat in the back, one row in front of the toilets. He tossed in his headphones and leaned his head against the window, minding his own business while the bus moved towards his home, where his pregnant girlfriend was waiting for him. McLean was on the bus with about 36 other people who were also traveling along the desolate stretch of the Trans-Canada Highway. At around 6 p.m. on July 30th, the bus stopped in Erickson, Manitoba, where a man named Vincent Waiguang Lee boarded the bus. Lee was a tall Asian man who looked to be about in his 40s, and when he boarded the bus, other passengers noticed that he seemed a little agitated and slightly confused, but he sat down in the front of the bus and quietly rode along the route. Nothing seemed of note to the passengers or McLean after leaving Erickson, Manitoba. They continued on their own journeys to wherever they were headed as the bus drove into the night. A short while later, the bus once again stopped at a station to let off and pick up some passengers, as well as allowing the passengers who were on the long travel to get off, stretch their legs, before making his way back onto the Yellowhead Highway towards Winnipeg. During this stop, Lee got up from his seat in the front of the bus and sat down near McLean, who was asleep in his seat, his head against the window with his headphones on. When Lee sat down, McLean woke up and said hello to the gentleman before falling back asleep in his seat, and the bus meandered down the highway a bit longer. People began to drift off to sleep at this point as it was encroaching on 8 p.m. and they had a bit longer of a journey ahead of them. Then, just before 8:30 p.m., people were awoken to a scream and chaos erupting on the bus. Lee had gotten up from his seat and emotionlessly and robotically stabbed McLean multiple times with a large knife in the neck and chest. McLean attempted to fight off Lee, but ended up falling onto the ground of the bus, making an escape from Lee nearly impossible. Noticing that something was happening at the back of the bus driver was yelling at Lee to stop, and he quickly pulled over to assess the situation. When he put the bus in park, people began running off onto the side of the deserted highway. All but the bus driver and one bus passenger got off as soon as the bus was parked. The passenger who remained on the bus was a young veteran who stayed to help intervene in the attack in an attempt to save McLean, and the bus driver pleaded with McLean to stop the attack. And all Lee would say as he was being pled with was, "Get emergency." A truck driver who was cruising along this portion of the highway also stopped when he noticed the commotion happening. He went onto the bus in an attempt to help the veteran and bus driver in the intervention as well. Despite their efforts to stop Lee from continuing to stab McLean, Lee managed to keep them away by slashing the large knife through the air. When they realized that their attempt to save McLean was not going to be possible, they were forced to get off the bus and stand on the side of the highway with the rest of the passengers, helpless. When the three got off the bus driver grabbed his keys and locked the bus door behind them in an attempt to keep Lee on the bus away from those outside. The truck driver returned to his truck and grabbed a hammer and a crowbar to use as weapons in the chance that Lee managed to exit the bus and attacked anyone else. During this, Lee attempted to flee the area with the scene of the crime by trying to drive the bus away. But the bus driver had engaged the emergency immobilizer system before he got off the bus, which rendered it inoperable. Also, huge shout out to this bus driver because that is super smart thinking in a time of chaos and all that was happening. During this commotion, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were called around 8:30 p.m., shortly after the attack began. They rushed to the scene that was near Portage la Prairie, but not before Lee had decapitated McLean and held his head up to the bus window for the rest of the passengers to see. When the police arrived, the 36 bus passengers were in hysterics. Many were crying, and others were vomiting as a response to the traumatic events that had unfolded on the Greyhound bus. By 9 a.m., the police still hadn't been able to get Lee off the bus and were in a standoff. This required the police to call special negotiators and a heavily armed tactical unit to the scene to help with speaking to Lee. When Lee noticed the extra law enforcement, he was heard saying that he would have to stay on the bus forever. It took 5 hours from the time the police showed up to when Lee was apprehended. And during this time, Lee continued to dismember McLean's body and also ate some of the pieces that he hacked off. As he was mutilating McLean's body, he would periodically parade the pieces in front of the bus windows for the other passengers and law enforcement to see. At 1:30 a.m., Lee began trying to escape the bus through one of the back bus windows by smashing out the glass. He threw his weapon and personal belongings out the broken window and began climbing out himself, but he was shot with a taser twice in order for the police to cuff him and put him in the squad car. As he was getting arrested, he apologized profusely to the officers and begged them to kill him while McLean's blood was smeared across his face. When the police boarded the bus to assess the damage done to McLean, they found and collected several of his body parts that had been scattered throughout the bus and thrown in different garbage cans throughout. Parts of his heart and both of his eyes were never able to be found, which caused officials to determine that Lee had eaten them during the 5-hour standoff. When Lee was brought to the station, they were also able to recover McLean's ear, nose, and tongue, which were all found in Lee's pocket. During the standoff with police, around 10:30 p.m., the other passengers were transported away from the scene to be interviewed by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and by 10 a.m. the following day, representatives from Greyhound had taken the passengers to a local store to replace any clothing that they had left on the bus. They were then transported to their final destination of Winnipeg to be reunited with their family and friends. A couple of days before the murder, Lee had left his home and wife via a note that said, "I'm gone, don't look for me, I wish you were happy." On the day he left, he headed to the Greyhound bus station, where he boarded a bus headed for Winnipeg. He got off the bus in Erickson, Manitoba, and stayed the night on a bench nearby. At the time he got off the bus, he was seen with at least 3 pieces of luggage, and at around 3 a.m. on July 29th, a witness saw him on the bench at the bus station, sitting bolt upright with his eyes wide open. At the bus station that morning, Lee was also seen selling much of his personal belongings, including his laptop, to a 15-year-old boy for $60. When the 1170 bus arrived at the station that day, Lee boarded and sat near the front. Vincent Waigung Lee was born in Dandong, Liaoning. I'm so sorry if I butchered that. In 1968. He was the second of 3 children in his family. Growing up, Lee was noted as a sickly child who experienced developmental delays. He did not learn to walk or talk until the age of 5 and started elementary school around age 9. Even so, his academic success improved when he entered high school, and by age 19, he went to the Wuhan Institute of Technology to study automotive engineering. He graduated with his bachelor's degree in 1982 and then worked in Beijing as a software engineer from 1994 to 1998. He eventually married his wife Anna, who he had met working at a factory in Beijing in 1995. According to Lee's wife and family, other than his developmental delays as a child, he showed no signs of mental illness. In 2001, Lee and his wife emigrated from China to Canada through the Federal Skilled Worker Program. He remained a Chinese citizen until he officially became a Canadian citizen in 2006. During his initial couple of years in Canada, Lee had menial jobs at a Winnipeg church to make enough money to support him and his wife. When Lee was working at the church, he would sometimes become frustrated as there was a very large language barrier between him and the congregation members. But he never seemed to be angry or cause any trouble before he eventually left the job in the spring of 2005. After he left, he began working as a forklift operator in Winnipeg, while his wife was working as a waitress in town. During his time working at the church, Lee had converted to Christianity after hearing the voice of God, who called him to the 3rd story of the Bible, which I looked up and couldn't find a definitive answer as to what story that is, but I would assume he was talking about the 3rd act of the Bible, which is God's new covenant people. And the voice of God also showed him to the second coming of Jesus, who he was told would come to save the people of Earth from an alien invasion. To prepare for this invasion, the voice of God would often order Lee to travel around Canada either by bus or on foot. His wife also corroborated this happening as Lee would disappear from home for days at a time. As this continued, Lee became more and more paranoid about the impending alien invasion that he began to carry a buck knife with him wherever he went, which he eventually used to kill Tim McLean. During this time, Lee's wife recalled that he would often go days without sleeping or eating, and would often spend his days crying and telling her about his visions sent from God. His family and friends worried a lot about him and urged him to go to the doctor to talk about his auditory hallucinations, but Lee was terrified of hospitals and refused to go. The hallucinations ended up causing him and his wife to separate in March of 2005, and Lee headed to Thompson, Canada, where he planned to purchase some land. It didn't take long for Lee to realize that he had no money to buy land, and he eventually began a job at Walmart as an overnight maintenance worker. After 4 months of work, he had saved up enough money to move back to Winnipeg in July of 2005, where he got a job as a gas station attendant and worked part-time at Tim Hortons. It was at this time that he had his first full-blown mental breakdown. In September of 2005, the voice of God told him that he had to leave everything behind and head to Toronto, where it would be easier to find work. After he was unsuccessful finding work in Toronto, God told him to return to Winnipeg on foot and to discard his belongings on the side of the road. According to Google Maps, the distance from Toronto to Winnipeg is 2,063 kilometers, or 1,281 miles, and it would take 19 days of constant walking to get from one to the other. After embarking on this trip, he was eventually found by the Ontario Provincial Police wandering Highway 427. He was dehydrated and malnourished when they found him and stated that he was following the sun due to a commandment from God. He was brought to the William Osler Health Center, where he was examined and doctors recommended that he stay for at least a month for observation. but he went against medical advice and checked himself out of the clinic. After he left the clinic, he called his wife and asked her to buy him a plane ticket back home to Dandong, where he moved back in with his parents. They noticed that he had a huge change in personality from before he moved to Canada 4 years prior, but he didn't seem to have any issue finding a job. The problem came when he had to stay employed for any longer than a couple of days. Lee's wife joined him back in China not long after he returned to try and reconcile their marriage. But his wife noticed that his mental issues had only gotten worse since they had separated that March, and she divorced him and moved back to her home in Winnipeg. Lee eventually moved back to Toronto, where he remained unemployed, but consistently called his ex-wife to tell her how much he missed her and that he wasn't able to work. She eventually caved and allowed Lee to move back in with her in Winnipeg until he was able to find a job in housing. Again, it wasn't long after that he abruptly left his ex-wife's home in 2006 for Edmonton, where he ended up living in his car after he was unable to find a job in the city. His ex-wife would regularly send him money, and then in July of 2007, she moved back in with Lee to work on their relationship, which improved over the following months. He eventually was able to find employment as a janitor, mechanic, and cashier at Walmart, a delivery driver for a newspaper company, and at McDonald's in service. After he had stable employment, Lee's ex-wife said that he seemed to be happy for the first time since his auditory hallucinations began. Unfortunately, this did not last long. In June of 2008, his mental health began to deteriorate incredibly fast. He flew to his parents' house in China, stayed 1 day, and then returned to Canada, stating that he had only returned to China to find a wife. He was then fired from Walmart for having an argument with another employee. On July 24, 2008, he left the home that he shared with his ex-wife, leaving the note that I spoke about earlier that said, "Don't look for me, I wish you were happy." And when his ex-wife saw the note, she was not worried, as at this time, Lee had done this multiple times throughout their marriage and then post-marriage. But on July 26th, she received a call from Lee where he said he was never going to return, which is when she began to worry about him. She obviously had a good reason to worry because 2 days after this phone call, Lee committed the horrific crime that occurred on bus 1170 to Winnipeg. Lee's murder trial began in March of 2009, where he pled not criminally responsible to his second-degree murder charge. His lawyers argued that he would not be able to be found criminally liable because he is mentally ill. When he put in the plea, he said only 3 words to the court: "Please kill me." The fact that he pled not criminally responsible meant that he had accepted that the crime had occurred, but he was claiming mens rea. During this plea, a psychiatrist that worked with Lee after he was arrested took the stand and presented that he had diagnosed Lee with schizophrenia. This mental illness, he stated, caused Lee to believe that McLean was an alien and demon in disguise who was an imminent threat to him and the other passengers on the bus. The psychiatrist went on to say that the attack was committed by Lee because he believed he heard the voice of God tell him that he needed to kill McLean or he would be killed himself. Furthermore, he needed to mutilate McLean's body to ensure that the alien wouldn't be able to come back to life. Due to the psychiatrist's testimony and diagnosis of schizophrenia, the defense and prosecution were in agreement that the best way forward was to involuntarily commit Lee to a mental institution instead of sending him to prison, and that Lee was not criminally responsible for the murder due to his mental disorder, and that he believed he was acting in self-defense. He was then sent to the Selkirk Mental Health Center. After the verdict was released, McLean's mother and father spoke to the media. His mom, Carol Dedeli, stated, and I quote, "Lee still did it. Whether he was in his right frame of mind or not, he still did the act. There was nobody else on that bus holding that knife, slicing up my child." End quote. His father, Tim McLean Sr., got a tattoo of his son over his heart. And to honor the memory of their son that was taken way too early in his life, they placed a white cross along the road in Portage la Prairie with his name on it, and an inscription that reads, "I think of you always, son. Love, Dad." After Lee was institutionalized, there was a plethora of things that happened, so here's just a quick rundown. First, McLean's family sued Greyhound, the Attorney General of Canada, and Lee for $150,000, and this case is still in limbo. On June 3, 2010, Lee was awarded outdoor walks within the confines of the mental health facility as long as he was supervised. On February 16, 2011, two of the passengers who were on the bus sued Lee, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and the Canadian government for being exposed to McLean's decapitation. They eventually dropped the charge in July of 2015. On May 30th, 2011, Lee's doctor at the mental health facility recommended that he receives more freedoms as he was responding well to his treatment. On May 17, 2012, Lee was awarded supervised visits to the town of Selkirk, where the mental health facility was located. In May of 2012, Lee gave a 45-minute interview to the Manitoba Schizophrenia Society, and I will talk about this interview and what he said in a couple of minutes after I go through this quick timeline. On March 6, 2014, Lee was allowed to leave the mental health facility by himself to the town of Selkirk, starting at 30-minute passes to full-day passes. On July 11, 2014, Bill C-14, also known as Tim's Law, went into force in Canada. This law ensures that public safety comes first when courts make decisions with respect to any accused person found not criminally responsible or unfit to stand trial on account of mental disorder, and for those people who are found not criminally responsible, who are found by a court to pose a higher risk of committing the future acts of violence, this legislation creates a new high-risk designation process. When someone is designated by a court as high risk, they would be held in custody in a hospital and could not be released by a review board until the high-risk designation was revoked by a court. Finally, the legislation enhances the safety of victims by ensuring that they are specifically considered when decisions are being made about mentally disordered accused persons, ensuring that they are notified when such an accused is discharged and where they intend to reside if the victim so desire, and allows for non-communication orders between the accused and the victims. On July 17, 2014, one of the first officers to the scene of the crime committed suicide. His family stated that due to the crime, he had suffered with extreme PTSD, which eventually led to his death. On February 27, 2015, Lee was given unsupervised day passes to Winnipeg as long as he had a functional cell phone with him at all times. On May 8, 2015, Lee was granted passes to go to group homes within the community. In February 2016, Lee legally changed his name to Will Lee Baker and was looking to leave his group home so he could live independently. On February 10, 2017, Lee was granted absolute discharge by the Manitoba Criminal Code Review Board with no legal obligations or restrictions pertaining to his independent living. In other words, he got out. Okay, so with all of that I just told you, I want to talk about a couple of things. The first is the interview that Lee gave in May of 2012. During this interview, Lee told the public that the reason he committed the crime was because he heard the voice of God, who sent him on a mission to protect people from an alien invasion. When he was on the Greyhound bus, the voice had instructed him to kill McLean because he was an alien that needed to be destroyed. The voice further told him that if he didn't kill McLean, he would be killed instead. The person who conducted the interview was Chris Somerville, the head of the Manitoba Schizophrenia Society, who had met with Lee around every 2 months over the previous 4 years. Lee further told Somerville that, and I quote, "I understand people are scared because of my behavior on the Greyhound bus. I am not at risk for anybody. I don't believe in aliens. I don't hear voices. I take my medication every day. I am glad to take it. I don't have any weird voices anymore." End quote. He also said that he wanted to be forgiven for his crime. After Lee was released in 2017, McLean's mom spoke to the media again, saying that there was no way to ensure that Lee will continue to take his medication and that she had no words. Lee's doctor attempted to calm the public, stating that he was confident that Lee would continue to take his medication and that he will continue to work with his treatment team after he's released. Furthermore, Somerville went to the public to say that, and I quote, "Lee is no longer a violent person. I will say, yes, he absolutely understands that he has to take his medication and has a desire to live a responsible, moral life and never succumb to psychotic episodes and not to hurt anybody ever again." End quote. On the other side, Mott Logan, a former Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer and forensic psychologist, stated that he didn't think the absolute discharge was in the best interest of the public, and that he would have liked to see there be some requirements for Lee's continued oversight by mental health professionals. He is afraid that Lee may have a relapse with the lack of insight in him taking his medicine. McLean's family vowed to fight the law that allows people who commit crimes and are found not criminally responsible to be released into the public without serving any time in jail. They want to make sure that Tim did not die in vain, highlighting the fact that his death highlights issues in the justice system in Canada. Lee's release caused public outrage and debate. A federal opposition interim leader, Rona Ambrose, even took to social media, writing, and I quote, "I think I speak for a lot of Canadians when I say this doesn't seem right. Justin Trudeau must put the rights of victims before the right of criminals." End quote. The other people who were on the bus have faced incredible difficulty after they experienced the traumatic events on that Greyhound. One passenger, who gave birth several years after the incident, suffered such bad PTSD that she was unable to care for her child, which caused the child to be placed in the foster care system for some time before being returned to her. The truck driver that stopped to help at the scene ended up with severe PTSD and alcoholism. He had such terrible nightmares that the only way he could sleep would be if he consumed alcohol. Other passengers are no longer able to feel safe in public, are no longer able to take public transit, find it really hard to meet new people, and also find it really hard to use their own kitchen knives. It's easy to see that there are many victims in this case that go beyond Tim McLean, including his family, the 36 other passengers on that bus, the bus driver, the truck driver, and the officials who arrived on the scene. From this tragedy, Tim's law is now in effect in Canada to better protect the victims and families when someone who is found not criminally responsible is held, and then if they are released. Unfortunately, I could not find a lot of information on Tim or the other victims in this case, but I want us to remember them. So, I know this was a really grisly case, but I hope you were able to hang in there to the end. As always, if you liked this episode, please give me 5 stars on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, as well as a review on Apple Podcasts. I'm always looking for cases to cover, so if you have a case suggestion, please visit the link in the show's Instagram page, @Crime on the Clarkfork. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll catch you next time with more big crime in small places.